Well, good afternoon. Good to have you with us. Welcome, welcome. We did what we could. We try to sing the upbeat hymns to overcome the lunch fatigue maybe that's setting in, and we give Pastor Stan the rough duty of keeping you all awake after having just fed you. So not entirely fair, but then there you go. So to introduce Stan and Carla Newton, what a blessing for me. And I could stay here till midnight telling you how much I love these folks, and particularly the history of what led to Stan Newton getting saved, and a roommate at the Naval Academy listening to theme tapes out of Bereka Church, and then Stan the unbeliever saying, "What's all that stuff about?" And then listening to it, and then getting saved, and then coming home and his mom getting saved, and his sister getting saved, and coming to Austin Bible Church and hearing Ralph Braun. And then, wouldn't you know it, Rhonda has a friend, a best friend from fifth grade, this Sharon Schneider character that started coming to Austin Bible Church because Shirley was going there and Rhonda was going there, and the girl who thought she was saved because of what she grew up with in a Lutheran church, she started to say, "Wait a minute, what's this gospel?" And so all of that's to say that was all years before I got here. And if we're celebrating my 30th year, I'm still several years behind Sharon. So I was an MP in the Army and came to Fort Hood, Texas, and then came down to Austin and visited, and I met the prettiest Sunday school teacher in the world and said, "Okay, this is a good church. I want to come to this church." And because I'm not the swiftest hammer in the drawer, the Lord took care of me in ways because Rhonda got married that January. And then I showed up 2 months later in March. And thanks to Rhonda's departure, she got married and moved to Florida. That left Sharon as the only single woman in the church, which then led me to believe that that's the reason why God brought me here, was so that I could meet her and ask her out. So anyway, which is a long way of saying thank you, Stan, for hearing the gospel and getting saved and all of the consequences that followed from that. If you have a conference folder, then you have the bio information and you've read through there and you know all about Stan and his time at the Naval Academy, his time at Dallas Theological Seminary, and everything else. What you may not know is actually back in the day when Ralph was thinking about retiring, Stan is the pastor that he wanted to take his place. Stan was the one that he really thought would come to ABC when his time at Dallas was done. So it didn't happen, and for that I also want to say thank you, Stan. Yeah. But the Lord knows what He's doing, and He has a purpose for every Peter, for every Paul, for every Stan, for every Bob, and I'm just glad more than anything that He's the head of the church and I'm not. And that He's the one that opens doors no man can close and closes doors no man can open. So our speaker this hour is Stan Newton. Please, Brother Stan, come and bring us the word.
I did. Thanks, Paul. So after that introduction, let me turn my computer on here, get my presentation up. Either Bob has become a five-point Calvinist, talking about the sovereignty of God through everything, or I am the butterfly that creates the effects. I actually want to, I was planning on sharing a little bit about how I came to faith in Christ. So I came to faith in Christ on April 10th, 1982 at the United States Naval Academy. My roommate, Kent Cattell, had come to faith in Christ at boot camp and was just on fire for the Lord, but he was prior enlisted. And so then he went to NAPS and then went to the Naval Academy, and as my roommate would share Christ with me. And then we both came to faith in Christ and then started attending a local church, Sunday school and preaching. And I remember becoming a voracious Bible reader when I was first saved. I just opened a book and began to read it and highlighting everything in it. So it actually looked like the yellow pages because the stuff would just leap off the page to me when I was reading the scriptures for the first time. And our Sunday school teacher seemed to know everything about the Bible, and our pastor seemed to know nothing about the Bible. And so we went to my pastor and said, to the Sunday school teacher and said, where are you getting this stuff? And you know what he had? He had a doctrinal notebook from Brookings, Oregon. And he had that notebook, and we said, well, how do you get that notebook? And they said, oh, they'll send it to you 50 pages at a time if you send them a letter. And they'll give them to you piecemeal. And so I did what any Christian would do is you don't have unless you ask. Is this correct? Right? So I said, I'm just going to write them a letter and ask for the whole thing because I'm in the military, and I knew there was sort of a favor toward those who are in the military, and it just asked for the whole thing at once, but I'm going to have them send it to my home of record. So they sent it to my home of record, which was Austin, because that's where my mom and dad were. And so then the doctrinal notebook showed up here, but they had included in it an envelope that said, Ralph Braun is the pastor of Austin Bible Church. And I went, So I looked up in this, some of you, well, probably most of you remember, there was a thing called the Yellow Pages. Looked up Austin Bible Church in the Yellow Pages and showed up at Christmas in 1982. And so that's how I got to know Ralph. And so then when I came home during the summers, I would come and I would attend Austin Bible Church. And then after I got commissioned and then went into the Navy, had always wanted to go to Dallas Seminary because I started listening to Bob Thiem tapes, and he had gone to Dallas Seminary. And then got a shore tour in Dallas. And so before I was out of active duty full-time, I'd completed about a year's work at Dallas Seminary at night and sometimes during the day in the summer. And then when Ralph's dad caught himself on fire and was burned all over his body, he needed the pulpit filled, and so he asked me to fly down. And so I had all these frequent flyer miles from being a Navy recruiter. That was my job in Dallas. While I was there, I had all these frequent flyer miles built up, so I used all those frequent flyer miles to fly down for free. And I stayed with my mom and dad, and then we would go to church at Austin Bible Church, and I would teach. But I do remember Ralph gave me the first opportunity to get up and speak, and my wife said, after I was done, if this is what you're going to do to make a living, we are going to starve. And so anyway, I hope I've gotten better since then. But no, yeah, and then after Dallas Seminary, I ended up going out to Westport, Washington, and pastoring out there. And then you know the rest of the story with Bob. But let me jump in here. I'm a dissertation away from finishing my PhD in Old Testament studies, and something that has really captured me is the Old Testament law, and then how it actually operated in their lives, and have just had a lifetime goal of teaching people, as a dispensationalist, that salvation has always been by grace through faith. That is a huge error knock on dispensationalism, that there are multiple ways of salvation and things like that. This has always been what we've taught, but then really what that in part was the function of the law and how was the law there, because I don't think people really kind of grasp what's going on there. And so really what I want to talk about today is Hammurabi, Moses, and the law of the goring ox. But the real thing, that kind of the underneath scholarly thing that I want to chat about, is comparative studies. And comparative studies are basically, for those of us who believe in historical exegesis, how do you read the Bible in its original historical context? Because there was an audience that was sitting in front of the biblical authors who were receiving what they said and understood it in their culture. And so comparative studies then comes out and says, well, what was their culture like? And there's actually at Dallas Seminary now sort of like a professional tension between the Old Testament department and the Bible exposition department, because the Bible exposition department is going to say the completed canon, the 66 books, is sufficient to interpret itself. Now, I know what they're saying when they say that, because they say you don't need to know any extra biblical information to help you with your exegesis. So my question, and what Dr. Bob Chisholm asks in openly is, well, do you ever open a lexicon? Do you ever open a lexicon and understand how a Greek word operated in the larger culture, and how Paul then would take that Greek word and use the concepts of that Greek word from what the people in front of him understood, and then put it into a biblical context? So you just used extra biblical information when you picked up your lexicon, because those words don't necessarily mean what they do for us today, and they have semantic ranges that are very much larger. So you are studying the church at Laodicea, and is it helpful to know that they had an aqueduct that brought in hot water, and they had an aqueduct that brought in cold water, and that when the aqueduct brought in lukewarm water, it tasted really bad? And so when they're talking about the church at Laodicea, and the master says, I wish that you were hot or cold, but if you're lukewarm, I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. The audience knew that, and maybe we in the modern world didn't know that until some archaeologist or some extant literature that got dug up was read. But then all of a sudden you go, oh, there was an audience sitting in front of the biblical author or the biblical communicator, and they were trying to speak to them in concepts and words that they understood. And this is a really important concept for any biblical teacher, to get up and say, does the audience matter? And the audience matters. And so kind of the tension that's going on is, I get what they're saying, because at one level, you don't want to say that the Bible is derived from its culture, right? We don't want to say that. It's revelation. It comes from God. And so if it comes from God, how then do we navigate this space of using extra biblical materials to help us with our understanding without importing into it pagan ideas? And that is the discipline of comparative studies. And what I've chosen today to do is to, and this is the outline of my talk. And is there a clock in here? Because I will just stop when I feel, oh, sure enough. It's digital. That was my problem. I was looking for something analog. I thought there was your stock report or something. Okay, so I see it up there. So I want to talk about biblical law in the context that it was written by comparing at one point only the law of the goring ox. And then I want to talk about comparative studies challenges, then a broad survey of ancient Near Eastern and Old Testament law and how they matched and how they don't match, and then talk in the end about maybe some better exegesis or application moves that we can make. But now, anybody who's wise knows, before I even begin talking, that if I take like an entire legal system from Babylon or an entire legal system from Eshnunna or the Middle Assyrian laws or the Hittites, and then compare on one law, just one law, with Old Testament law, that there's just no way you can draw that parallel with just one verse, right? So conceptually, I understand that. But what I also know is that you guys have a larger concept of law and things like that. And I will share that so that we're not just comparing at one and then judging a whole system on one verse and a whole other system on one verse. And I hope that makes sense to you. So that's what I'm going to go through. But I want to compare the law of the goring ox. And the reason that is because the law of the goring ox shows up in Hammurabi, and it shows up in the laws of Eshnunna, but it doesn't show up in Hittite or Middle Assyrian laws or even Egyptian laws. But it's in some cases almost verbatim with what we find in Hammurabi and what we find in Eshnunna. And so Eshnunna was a nation that was north of Babylon and south of Assyria, over in the east, away from the Jews. So here's from our text in Exodus: when an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten. But the owner of the ox shall not be liable. But if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but has not kept it in, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall be put to death. If a ransom is imposed on him, then he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is imposed on him. If it gores a man's son or daughter, he shall be put to death. He shall be dealt with according to this same rule. If the ox gores a slave, male or female, the owner shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. When one man's ox butts another's ox, so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and share its price, and the dead beast also they shall share. Or if it is known that the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has not kept it in, he shall repay ox for ox, and the dead beast shall be his. So that's our text from Exodus. Now here's Hammurabi. If an ox, while walking along the street, gored a man and has killed him, such a case has no grounds for legal action. Now there's a translation issue here, and I don't read cuneiform. So those who read cuneiform also translate it, if someone pushes an ox while it's in the street and kills it. So in this case, it's not the ox that kills someone. In this case, it's someone kills the ox. The owner can't claim damages against the guy who's hired it. Okay, so now I'm going to go with the first one because I'm going to say the biblical text is talking about what happens when an ox causes damage, not what happens when an ox has been damaged, except for our law later when my ox kills your ox. And then we got to do something, right? So I'm going to go with paragraph 250 as the top one. The law continues. If a man's ox was prone to goring, and his neighborhood has made known to him that it was prone to goring, yet he has not trimmed its horns, and did not control the ox so that said ox gored and has caused the death of a member of the Awilim class, he will give half a mina of silver. If it was a man's slave, he shall give a third of a mina of silver. And I've highlighted those particular numbers or those fractions because I'll talk about that later because it makes sense. So there's our two laws. And so now we want to make a comparison between these two laws. Now, basic legal structure. We have what's called case law or casuistic law or common law, and that is a if-then action. If this happens, then this is the reaction. And this is what you're going to do. And that tends to be statute interpretation or what we call bench law. Judges make these laws. So there's statutes that are existing in the culture, and then something happens that's like what that statute is speaking to, but then a judge has to interpret what is going on. So that's just case law. Statutory law is legislated law. Statutes originate from higher laws, but then they can be challenged. So the idea here is that we come up with a law like, don't speed. And then somebody says, well, the Constitution never says that you can make that law. And so we're going to challenge it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court can actually decide, right? You can't make a law that says don't speed. Do you agree with this? This is what statutory law is. And statutory law comes more from a principle. It's made by legislative bodies, or in the ancient Near East, by kings. And kings actually had people who adjudicated these laws, who were judges. But in our system in America, it's very different. We have a judicial branch that makes bench law. It interprets and has if-then casuality, and it will put into books, and people will research all these things, and then if you're in a lawsuit with somebody or there's a case brought up, then the judges will appeal to past decisions. And that's very different than when a legislative body makes a law and then it has to be interpreted in various ways through. And states do this all the time because the very same principle that occurs in Texas, or the very same law that may be in Texas, may be very differently interpreted in Pennsylvania, where I live. So you're going to be I think still in Texas you can kill someone, it's the death penalty, if you steal their horse. And you know why this is, right? Because you took his livelihood. So at some level, stealing a car maybe could be the same idea in the future. If you can't make it to work because you don't have a car, but that law never translated into that. But on the prairie, if you took somebody's horse, you've been taking their life. And so then there was the death penalty for there's no penalties in Pennsylvania for taking somebody's horse like that. And so it's not because you're just Wild West stuff, it's because it's a different culture where stealing something like that is occurring and the implications of it. And so you have this structure of an if-then casuality, and then you have statutory law. Now, this is all kind of important because when we begin to look at laws, Old Testament law, by its very structure, is very, very different than the cultural surroundings of Israel because it's apodictic in nature. And so the key feature of some of these laws, and I'll talk about what apodictic nature means in a second, but what is similar about our goring ox laws? And I'm actually going to lay them side by side later, and we're going to look at them, and I'm going to have some audience participation, hopefully, and you're going to say, oh, I see the difference, and why those differences would be there. But in both sets of laws, they are similar in the form of accident. If it was an accident, no one's culpable. Now, let me ask you a question. Is that true in America today? In America today, if it was an accident, there's somebody who's got a good enough lawyer to figure out somebody who can be blamed. But in the Old Testament law, if it was an accident, it was an accident, or what insurance companies call an act of God. If you are in absentia, if you are not there and you're the owner of the ox, you could be held reliable. So there's a sense of which the owner, if it's the owner's ox, and that ox does something to harm someone else, but we remember if it had been prone to do that in the past, right? In both sets of laws, there was this idea that if you had a rogue ox, for the second time or the third time, you should have had some responsibility in taking care of it. And then there was also a difference in the penalty with regards to status. Do you remember in the biblical law, if the ox gored and killed a male or a female slave, then they would have to pay 30 shekels of silver. In the Hammurabi law, if it killed a member of the Awilam class, so the Awilam class is basically landed people, people who were like free citizens. But if you were part of the royal court or a member of the king's household and you weren't a free person or you were a slave and an ox gored you, the penalty was not imposed on the owner of the ox. So there was a difference between who the victim was, which was kind of interesting. But they're similar in the fact that both laws parse out status of the person in the society. And here's where they're different: severity of penalty and property. Because Hammurabi's law says nothing about if my ox kills your ox, right? His law said nothing about that. But Moses said that if my ox killed your ox, then I get your living ox, and we get to split the dead beast, right? We're going to split the dead beast. So there was some responsibility there in terms of property, so that's different. And then severity of the penalty. In Exodus, you put to death someone. In Hammurabi, you only pay money. And so we have to figure out, well, like, that seems like Exodus is a little bit more harsh, right? It seems like it's a little bit more restrictive, and we'll talk about that. But we now have to ask the question, if laws come from principles or character or understanding or something like that, if God is giving the law, then what might be the underlying rationale for the similarities and differences? And this is where comparative studies comes in. This is the question that comparative studies are going to ask, because you could literally go on the website somewhere and type in Hammurabi, Law of the Goring Ox, and the Torah, and somebody will come up with a conclusion that Moses simply just borrowed from Hammurabi. He just cut and pasted and then wrote the revelation that we say was given at Sinai. So in other words, Moses borrowed, because in Western rationalism, there's no supernatural. So you got to try to understand, like, where would these thoughts have come from? And so it's just from the larger culture that are around them, and they borrowed it from the larger culture around them. But we don't think that way. We think that this is revelation coming from God. But like I said earlier about Laodicea, or maybe even in Philippi, if you're in Philippi, isn't it kind of nice to know that there are a whole lot of retired Roman soldiers in Philippi when you're reading that book? And so there's really nothing explicit in Philippians that says, oh, there's a whole group of retired Roman soldiers here, that you would read and go, oh, I get why Paul is saying that. But knowing that helps you read it better. And so that's the kind of questions that comparative studies are going to try to figure out is like, why is this rationale here? And then as a discipline, we got to talk about the fact that for millennia, the only document that testified to any historical happenings in the ancient Near East was the Old Testament. So people are reading in 1200 AD, 1300 AD, and they have no concept of who the Sumerians are, or who the Babylonians are, or who the Assyrians are, or there were scholars who didn't even believe that the Hittite Empire existed because there was no evidence of it except for the one book that we had that testified to it. So the Old Testament then has this primal place in speaking about history because it's not only our first, but it's also our elemental window into what's going on. And then Napoleon went to France. And why does that matter? I'll talk about it. Let me talk about this first, because this is an anthropological idea. So now you're gonna just be an anthropologist, and most anthropologists are secular humanists. But now as an anthropologist, you're going to say, well, the reason Hammurabi has a law like Moses has a law is because there's a sort of a spiritual unity amongst all mankind. And that doesn't mean they believe in the supernatural. It just is that there's just something common to all human people. And so there's marriages of Aboriginal people in Australia, and there's marriages of people in America. And so we see male and female pair off, and so there just must be something that is a spiritual unity amongst all mankind. It just works out better for us when we do it that way. But as to why it's that way, we're not going to explain it, but they explain all their theories that way. Or there's sort of this historical stream, aka evolution. In other words, this is how the tribe survived. So this is how an anthropologist is going to approach this comparative studies material. It's either like, kind of like all people everywhere talk about the same thing. Like all people everywhere don't like their stuff being stolen. So all people everywhere just make up laws about stealing stuff. And that would be sort of a spiritual unity idea. But then for the historical stream idea is that somebody a long time ago thought it was a really good idea to say, don't bear false witness. And then somebody, after they cooked up that idea, everybody kind of looked at one another and nodded and say, this is a great idea. We're going to write laws about that. And so that's kind of the way that anthropologists are going to approach this area of comparative studies. And that's, beloved, who do most of it. So when you're reading any of this stuff, most of it's coming from a perspective that doesn't hold to the supernatural like we do. And so then as you're reading all that stuff, it feels like you're just wading through like 3 feet of thick mud. Like I'm trying to take a step to get to the next thing and try to understand even comparing these cultures. But then let's talk about Napoleon and the Rosetta Stone. So you know what happens is Napoleon goes down to Egypt to invade down there, right? And he goes down to Egypt to invade, and while he's there, he brings with him a bunch of archaeologists and a bunch of linguists and a bunch of people because he wants to actually study, and they find the Rosetta Stone. And when they find the Rosetta Stone, does anybody know what 3 languages are written on the Rosetta Stone? Hieroglyphics, the Demotic Greek text, which is kind of like a script text, and Greek. And guess who knows Greek? Western civilization. They read Greek. They had gone through the Renaissance. So all the old Latin texts and all the old Greek texts are there. And so they have 3 parallel texts. So they can now translate hieroglyphics. And now they have the Demotic Greek text, so they can begin to read old ancient Egyptian documents. And so this is the middle 1800s. And then everybody starts reading these ancient documents and they go, oh my gosh, all this stuff sounds a whole lot like the Bible. They're talking about the same concepts that are in the Bible. Now, as a believer in Jesus Christ, because God has preserved His Word throughout the centuries, I'm reading the text, but what eyes am I reading the text through? My modern Western culture. And so what I have a tendency to do is impose upon the text my modern Western culture, and it is so hard not to do that. It is so hard not to do that. So in Pennsylvania, where I live now, it is very uncommon for a person, when you shake their hand, to share their name with you. Now, I saw a lot of eyes go up because here in Texas, not only are you going to shake their hand and they're going to tell you what their name is, they're going to start talking about where they came from and where they lived and start giving a little bit of backstory so you can have a conversation and connect. And so when I first moved to Pennsylvania, I thought I had just met a few people who didn't want to talk or share. And then I found out it's the entirety of the whole culture down there to not share. I literally have people in my church who have gone to church with one another for over a decade and they don't know each other's names. And you begin to read the New Testament and think about like all those one another passages. And you think, how do you even do those in a context like that? Now, I grew up in a culture where there was that kind of hospitality or that kind of outreach, and to me that seems normal. To them, who I am seems radically abnormal. And so when we have those kinds of prejudices, it's really hard to do exegesis without prejudice. And I think everybody needs to admit that. Anytime anyone's doing hermeneutics or reading the text, we like to believe we can be totally rational, but we are vested in something as we read, right? We are vested in something as we read. And that's why you should be courageous enough to put out what the ideas and things that you are saying and let other people who are reading the same text challenge what you are saying. But the Rosetta Stone, was it a step forward? And on one hand, it was yes, and one hand, it was no. And here's why yes is good. Because all of a sudden, and not only included with the Rosetta Stone, but there's also another document that was found that allowed us to read cuneiform and then eventually start reading all those clay tablets and start reading the Assyrian stuff and start reading the Hittite stuff and start reading all the old ancient stuff. But the reason it was good is because it gave us access to those texts. But the reason it was bad is because the Old Testament had held a primal place in everybody's mind so that every time somebody dug something out of the ground, they immediately compared it to the Old Testament. And part of the issues of comparative studies is was there even a connection between those cultures? So you're reading something from Eshnunna, or you're reading something from the Elamites, and you wonder how much connection was there even between the Jews and the people in Elam. So some scholar reads something from Elam, and the only thing that he really has to compare it to is the Old Testament. So he comes up with one of two conclusions. Either the Bible got it from Elam, or Elam got it from the Bible. And that is a completely reductionist way to think about how these things go back and forth. Because for us, the text is so dominant in our culture for so many years. But there were cultures in the ancient Near East who knew nothing of the Jews. Or if they heard of them, they didn't interact with them culturally at all. And so then all of a sudden you cook up something from one of their laws and it looks a whole lot like what's in the Old Testament, and you go, well, somebody got it from somebody. And that is a very difficult thing. So that's why the Rosetta Stone is not a step forward, because for over 100 years, people practiced this discipline saying this is either coming from the Old Testament or it's either the Old Testament borrowed from it. Until a guy named Meyer Malol in 1990 actually wrote a short treatise on the fact that maybe we ought to just talk about the discipline of comparative studies before you start saying this was borrowed and that was borrowed, because you can't even show a geographic connection between those two people groups. You can't even show a linguistic connection between those two people groups. So how can you explain to me as a scholar that they were even talking about this stuff in any way that could show up in the Old Testament? And that's a really important kind of scholarly philosophical understanding, because it's just so easy to have the pedestrian idea that pretty much Adam knew a whole lot of this stuff, and then people began sinning, but everybody kind of knew who God was. And then just kind of went off the deep end, but they were very clear about monotheism, and they were very clear about the creation story, and they were very clear about all this other stuff, and that's just simply not true. So then there was a guy named George Smith in, I think it was 1878, and they had dug out of the ground the Assyrian creation myth, which was the Enuma Elish and Gilgamesh. And in that is a flood story that looks very much like Genesis 6 through 9. The only problem with their flood story is the reason the earth got flooded is because the gods were capricious and mean. And people were down here doing what they were supposed to do. And when you read the biblical story, it's exactly the opposite. So even the details are very much looking the same. And a part of the narrative story about how their guy who built the boat got the information. The reason he needs to build a boat because the capricious and mean gods are about to wipe out humanity, and then he kind of says, let's save humanity. If you read Genesis 6 through 9, that's not what's going on. Every intention of their heart is wicked. And Yahweh goes, we're going to hit reset button. And so then he informs Noah, who builds a boat, and his family gets on, and then the animals get on, and then the flood comes. But it is God being compassionate and gracious and kind to preserve his creation while he's allowing sin to be judged. But in the Enuma Elish, the humans haven't done anything wrong. Now, that sounds like a story from the wicked human heart. I am good, I am fine, and God's the bad guy, which goes all the way back to the garden. Did God really say he's holding out on you? And so in 1878, George Smith comes out with this, and everybody goes, oh my gosh, the flood didn't even occur. It's just a story to explain some theology. Now, we are already living in the stream of Western rationalism where they have decided that anything supernatural, right, anything supernatural can't be verified, and therefore, if it's not verifiable, it can't be called truth. And so you can't tell me the resurrection's true because we can't scientifically recreate it. Right? We have no evidence for it. That's what they would say. So let's do it this way. If we all had 3 chicken eggs and we cracked them and we stuck them into a pan and we put some heat to it and scrambled them, then everybody would have a pile of scrambled eggs. And you could do that yesterday and today and tomorrow, and I think we would all agree that if we followed that procedure, that we had 3 separate eggs, cracked them, put them in a pan, put it over heat, stirred them all up, we get a pile of scrambled eggs. However, you can't prove that anybody ate those eggs for breakfast. You could not prove that I ate scrambled eggs for breakfast unless there was a witness who sat with me at breakfast and said, I watched Stan eat scrambled eggs for breakfast. You agree? But you couldn't come up with an experiment that would look like Stan eating eggs for breakfast to prove that I did it. So we have eyewitness, which we also receive as truth, right? Testimony. So we have like 500 people who saw Jesus rose from the dead written into our documents. And there were people who, when that document was received in Corinth, would have gone, oh, I don't believe that. I'm going to go see if that's true. And then they would have gone to maybe the 422 of them that were still alive and said, did you see Jesus? Oh, yeah, I saw Jesus rose from the dead. Oh, yeah, I saw Jesus rose from the dead. So our New Testament documents come into existence in a context of witnesses who are going, yep, that's true. Raised from the dead. Saw him in Galilee. And he was with his disciples. And he was telling us a whole lot of stuff about the Old Testament, like maybe the law and the prophets and the Psalms all testify about me, which Luke wrote in 24, right? And so the whole idea here is that as we are going forward and thinking about evidence and doing comparative studies and embracing the fact that there actually is the concept of a supernatural that can be testified to and written down, that the general person reading the Old Testament these days in scholarly circles does not believe that. So think about how much you have to extract out of the Old Testament if the miraculous is not there. Like no Exodus, which, by the way, is the central miracle of the Old Testament, right? That's the central miracle of the Old Testament, that the Jews were born out of slavery into being a full nation. And that had never happened in history. Oh, and if you just, by the way, want to see it again, we'll bring them back after Babylon. So we're going to just destroy the nation again. They were in slavery once, and then we wiped them out again. Oh, and then they showed back up. So there's the Babylonian return from exile is not as important as Exodus, but that's a pretty important thing that happened, that they go through the Red Sea. So now I have a document that's testifying to these things historically. And a bunch of people who are reading it who want to compare it to other documents that say this stuff couldn't possibly come to pass, so we're comparing myth to myth. Well, wait a minute. I'm comparing real events, theologically interpreted by prophets and biblical writers who are recording for me historical things that have happened from Yahweh's perspective and why these things are the way they are. And so now the current state of comparative studies is after Meyer Malol comes along, he has said, well, how are we going to do this? How are we going to take, like, some cultures have fragmentary evidence, whereas for Jewish culture, we have a book that covers 1,000 years of their history. Like from the beginning of the Torah all the way to Malachi is 1,000 years, right? And so then you find some archaeological clay pot somewhere that has a picture on it and it talks about a particular culture, and that is just fragmentary evidence. You don't even necessarily know how they operated on a day-to-day basis. And then the other thing is as you're going into comparative studies, and this is why it's so hard to do this as a conservative scholar, is because we believe that this is a theologically given text, and it's theologically framed, and it has important things to say in it, and this isn't just what Hammurabi did, because when Hammurabi wrote his laws were a political statement. His laws were not written so that the common people could even read them. And then we have to understand whether or not there's ethical, cultural differences and stuff like that. So I'm getting back to the law of the goring ox, but by far the Old Testament is far more apodictic in nature. And so apodictic means just an unassailable truth. It's just a principle that stands as non-negotiable or undebatable. So the Old Testament law is based on what we call apodictic truth, not case study. Our Bibles are not pragmatic primarily. And what that means is if it works now, it works. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, the culture might change. So we now have to change the if-then casuality because it might be a different state, it might be a different culture, it might be a different situation, and so things can move. So the Old Testament is by far more apodictic in nature. And here, just let me ask you a quick question. How many narrative chapters do we have in our Bible before the law shows up? 69. All of Genesis and 19 chapters of Exodus before the law shows up. Yahweh wants you to have a whole lot of backstory before he starts giving laws. Covenant exists between God and his people. In other words, relationship exists prior to the giving of commands. So when my oldest was born, Victoria, Carla and I, while she was pregnant, did not sit down and write out a list of laws that she would have to obey the day she came into existence. So there was relationship, mother-father, with Victoria prior to we began giving her laws. And when did we start giving her laws? When she started acting out of character, which was pretty early. But giving our view of total depravity. But the whole point here is that the Old Testament is by far more apodictic in nature. And so when Yahweh says, you shall not steal, notice it's very different than if you steal then. That's a totally different way to communicate. The Old Testament, other ancient Near Eastern law codes had apodictic laws in them, but this is the great move in history that came through the Torah. That the law itself was apodictic in nature. So it was looking like something they had seen before, but its very structure was very different than way before. And so how can you not steal if you have a sinful heart? Let me just give you a precursor. What is the new covenant? Give you a new heart. This has been the problem all along. This is what we said in Genesis 6. The heart of man is desperately wicked. No, that's Jeremiah, sorry. That their heart was desperately, every intention of theirs was evil. That's the issue. This is where Yahweh is going with everything in the way he gives his revelation. You need a new heart. So the Old Testament law is by far more apodictic in nature. And then the Torah is completely unique as a document because the Torah is a narrative story. Right? The Torah is a narrative story. You've got the whole book of Numbers. We've got Leviticus. There's a vav consecutive at the beginning of the book of Leviticus. A vav consecutive in the Hebrew just means I'm continuing what was just said. So what's in Exodus chapter 40? Oh, Moses completes the tabernacle. And then the glory of the Lord comes in, and the glory of the Lord comes onto the tabernacle, and Moses runs out. Time out. He was just on the mountain with him. Why is he running now? He saw Yahweh face to face, came down from the mountain glowing. And then they build the tabernacle and the glory of the Lord shows up, and you'd have thinking that everybody would run out except who? Moses. I've been here before. Moses comes out, vav consecutive, say to the sons of Israel, if anyone wants to approach me, this is how you do it. And they start what later becomes in the New Testament, the Korban sacrifice, the draw near sacrifice. And so all of Leviticus is just a continuance of, we built the tabernacle and now I've given you a way to approach me. And so Leviticus is just a big book on how you can get near to God. And so the Torah as a unique document is using law for a very different reason than ancient societies used law to just keep law and order. And then they have motivational clauses in there that provide exegetical insight. So here's a motivational clause. Honor your father and mother. What's that? So that your days may be prolonged in the land. So apparently, I'm giving you a rule to obey, but I want you to think about why you're obeying it. And the Hebraic law has far more motivational clauses in it than any other ancient Near Eastern law code, which being translated means I want you as the listener to think about it. So I sat next to a Jewish lady on the airplane coming from Philly to here. And she said, you're not allowed to eat dairy with meat. And I said, where does it say that? And she goes, well, it says it in the law. I said, no, it doesn't. It says you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. That's what it says. I said, you have 3,000 years of commentary on that that's telling you not to. But the difference between us and you is what we call the perspicuity of Scripture. We believe you can just read it, and what it says is what it says. And I don't need 3 centuries of rabbis to tell me. But she was like 100% sure she wasn't allowed to eat it. And I said, no, that was a pagan practice, and Yahweh was telling them not to do it so they wouldn't look like the pagans. He was not saying at all you couldn't eat yogurt with bacon in the morning. Well, wait a minute. Bacon. You could add steak and yogurt. Bacon comes later. Okay, so casuistic is if-then accountability. I got to get rolling here. If a man gives to his neighbor money or goods to keep safe and it's stolen from the man's house, then, this is if-then casuality. If the thief is found, he shall pay double. If the thief is not found, the owner of the house shall come near to God to show whether or not he has put his hand to his neighbor's property. And then we'll go on. The apodictic is an underlying principle, what we've always talked about. The Decalogue is this. The Decalogue is the basis of all the later Jewish law. So all of later Jewish law is based on principle, apodictic, non-negotiable standards, right? And thou shalt not commit adultery. It literally does not say what will happen if you do that, right? It doesn't say. It just says don't do it. You can think about why not doing it, but don't do it. That's what it's saying. And then the Old Testament has motivational clauses. And so this is the one that we already talked about is honor your father and mother that your days may be long in the land that the Lord is God giving you. So there's a reason why I should be doing that. So let me just talk about modern signs. You're going down the street and you see a yellow sign, it has a deer on it. That's caution, right? And what's that deer on there for? Because you don't want to hit the deer. Why do you not want to hit the deer? Damage your car. Cause a wreck for somebody else. Okay, so now you're going down the street and you see a little sign and it has yellow on it, only this time there's a kid on it. Now you don't want to hit that kid either, do you? You don't want to hit the deer and you don't want to hit the kid, but there's a whole huge difference between why you don't want to hit that kid than you want to hit that deer. I see dead deer all the time in Pennsylvania on the road. No one stops. They just go, oh, there's another dead deer. I guarantee you would nail the brakes and there would be black on the pavement if you saw a dead kid on the side of the road. And nobody was standing over that kid. There's something about that child that's different than that deer that would provide, in kind of the same imagery, the motivation for why you don't want to hit that kid, right? And the Old Testament law is based on all this understanding that we have of God creating us in His image. This is why you shall love your neighbor as yourself, because you're loving someone who's made in God's image. And to disrespect a human is to disrespect the Creator. But the greater law is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength, because you have to start there. And then you go to the image bearer. So here's some interesting law code comparison. In the ancient Near East, kings gave the law. And this is one you can think about for a long time. But Moses gives the law and dies, and there is no succession plan. Joshua does not give laws. Joshua takes over leadership, but he's not a lawgiver. In the ancient Near East, every time you got a king, you got new laws. Or every time you switch from one party to another politically, you get new presidential, right? As we already said, it's foundationally apodictic in nature, and then it's grounded in Yahweh's character as creator and redeemer versus royal propaganda. Ancient Near Eastern law was primarily given as royal propaganda. I'm keeping everything safe, so you should just like me as your king. But now, since we've grounded the law in Yahweh's character and nature, why do you keep the Sabbath? What does it say in Exodus for why you keep the Sabbath? This is the way I created the heavens and the earth. I created the heavens and the earth in 6 days and took off on the seventh. You keep the Sabbath because of that. And then you begin to think, he just told me I can be like him. Right? If you read that law correctly, Yahweh just said you can be like me. What was our issue in the garden? You can be like him. Now Yahweh has said that. He's given a principle. You don't have to be a slave anymore. You can be free. You can be like me. And oh, by the way, that motivational clause changes in Deuteronomy 5. No longer shall you work on the Sabbath, nor let your wife, nor let your sons, nor let your daughters, nor your male servants, nor your female servants, nor your donkeys, because you were once a slave in Egypt. And so now there becomes a social responsibility of practicing Sabbath to bless those who are around you. So you, as someone who is imitating Yahweh and his nature, are someone who gives freedom to other people. You're basically a freedom fighter in a fallen world that's rebelling against God. Okay. And then the scope of readership. For the most part, all ancient Near Eastern law codes were kept among the elite. This book was written so that the common person would read it. In fact, the common person was told to write it down on their doorpost and keep it in little phylacteries on their foreheads and their arms, and have Scripture everywhere in your life because you can read it, and I want you to read it, and I want you to understand it, and I want you to obey it because I'm speaking to you about everything in your life. So now, here's a quick exercise in comparison. We'll go through this. So this is just the answer to the test before we get there. Old Testament law values life way differently than other ancient Near Eastern law codes. The extent of the application is far more broad, extending into the community, and the elasticity of judgment. And that's my favorite one, and we'll get there. Okay, so let's look at this. What's the difference here? Notice Hammurabi only deals with a man. Moses deals with a man and a woman. We all say that the Old Testament is this kind of like misogynist, patriarchal document. But in Genesis 2, it says that for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife. In a culture that primarily passed down identity from a father to a son, to say at the teleological beginning that the primary relationship that you have is with this partner that I have made for you would have sounded like Moses was a long-haired hippie, which you guys understand, an old long-haired hippie here in Austin, right? I mean, you have a cultural understanding of what that is. There's no one like that where I live. But there's a lot of long-haired old hippies here in town. And they would say something like this, like your primary relationship was with your wife, not your dad. Because in that culture, that's the way inheritance was passed down. So notice this law also speaks to the woman because she has ontological value equal to the man, because what is the first thing that Adam said in Genesis 2? Bone of bone, flesh of flesh. I recognize her as a fellow image bearer. Then she shall be called woman, for she came out of man. So the priority of role is secondary to the understanding of being made in God's image. It's all in the beginning. It all comes out later. But it also comes out in the law, because if you kill my wife, that's like killing an image bearer, but that's not what Hammurabi thinks. And so both of these are the same, right? That there is this idea of personal responsibility if your ox was prone to goring, right? And here we stone the ox, and here you just give money. So there's a greater extent to the Old Testament law going, you got to take care of the problem so that it doesn't happen again, right? There's an ongoing responsibility that you have, but here you just have to pay half a mina of silver for the Awilim class. By the way, half a mina of silver is 30 shekels. Where have you heard that before? 30 shekels for the slave in Exodus. So the Old Testament law would equate a slave in Israel to the highest landed level of person in Assyria or Babylon or Hittite. That's kind of interesting to me, that the lowest person in Israel would be equated in the law to the highest person over here. And probably why you could pay for a slave, not because they weren't made in God's image and they weren't important, is because they had no family connections. They were probably just a single person living with a family, and so if they were killed, then you're not going to incur blood guilt. And there's a whole lot of laws in the Old Testament about, like, if somebody from your family kills somebody in my family, then I can run down somebody in your family and kill them for blood guilt. And this is why they have the cities of refuge, right? So that's a cultural moment. But the slave itself, as they're saying, is valuable just like the highest level in another culture. And probably the reason was, and that's an exegetical question, but the reason the slave was allowed to be ransomed, or the penalty was allowed to be ransomed with money, is because there was no family connection. But notice this. What if my ox kills someone in your family? Somebody from your family could not necessarily kill me, but could ransom me. Because it says here, if a ransom is imposed on him, then he shall give for the redemption of his life, mine, because my ox killed you, whatever is imposed on him. What's this saying? Mercy triumphs over judgment. You have an opportunity to not extract the penalty, life for life. So eye for eye, tooth for tooth was never required. It was the limit. You can't take 2 eyes for 1 eye. You can't take 2 fingers for 1 finger. The most you can ever take is 1 eye. But notice, what is the eschatological import of a law that allows for mercy? The cross is coming. We're waiting for God to not extract the penalty, life for life, from us and extend mercy, because the law demands death, which is the substitutionary atonement of Christ. But the point is that from the very beginning they should have understood that you could, reading this law, say, oh my gosh, he's the provider for his family. If we kill him, his family will starve. So we're going to ask for a ransom instead. There's nothing in Hammurabi about my ox killing your ox and responsibility. So the extent of the Mosaic law is further. Now, real quick, some concluding observations. The Torah has a greater range. And when I think about, I have something written down here I wanted to say about that. Oh, that integrates all of life. The Torah is integrating all of our life. It's not just a case law, situation by situation. It has an emphasis on human life that is far different than the world that it came into. And then I said, it allows for merciful judgment, which points to something coming in the future from an Old Testament perspective. There's going to be a time when I judge, and you're going to go free. And what is that ransom? Well, it's going to be, because the law requires it, life for life, but it's going to end up being Jesus that pays for it. So first of all, I think we have not unlocked the value of our canon yet, if you're not reading Deuteronomy very carefully and the motivational clauses and going, why are these things there? Because this is what we tend to do in the New Testament. The law has been fulfilled by Christ. Why bother reading it? Right? So we don't value it. But if you read it closely and you see things like from the very beginning mercy was coming, you begin to think and act differently. Next, what principles have we yet to extract? Because we kind of just like do what Luther said, law and grace, and then we treat the law as like a bunch of rules and then think of it as a vehicle for salvation, which it never was, and then go, okay, so those people kind of believe that, and you just come up with all kinds of wrong ideas about what the law was doing functionally, because when the law is apodictic by nature, the law is literally saying you need a new heart. And the question of your prayer time should be, can you give me a new heart? Isn't this what the law said? Deuteronomy 29. I've told you all this stuff, but you don't have a heart to obey it. So, me and Pastor Cliff Brevidge are sitting on the plains of Moab, and we're about to go take the land. And I look over at Cliff and I go, hey, before we get in there, do you think we should ask for a new heart? Because this book literally says we're going to get kicked out of the land if we don't obey this law. I mean, didn't Moses anticipate that? He prophesied. He says, you're not going to obey it, so you're going to get kicked out of the land. And then you're going to be in a foreign land. You're going to repent. You're going to come back, and I'm going to bring you back. And so this whole prophetic arc is given in the Torah, and somebody should have raised their hand and said, how about just a new heart so we don't have to go through all this? Let me give you a New Testament parallel. When we see him, we will be like him. Why aren't we praying that now? Why wait? I mean, this is the inheritance. Oh my gosh. If I'm going to be like him when I see him, can I see him now? Can I be like him now? Can I walk like him now? So, I don't think we've truly grappled with the dangers of antinomianism either. I mean, there's people that have proclaimed Christian liberty and do all kinds of, I'm going to use a Navy word, something filled in stuff. And just because they're antinomian, because they don't understand what the real purpose of the law was. And then I think responsible scholarship fortifies faith. And so when we're talking about these comparative studies and everything, when you take the Old Testament Torah and you compare it to the Old Testament laws that it was in, there are many things that are very much the same, like the law of goring ox, or like other laws that are very simple about theft and murder and things like that. But the underlying core nature of what God was doing and trying to communicate through what he spoke in the first 5 books of the Bible is very different than, here's a bunch of rules, you guys will never obey them, and I'm going to get mad at you. That's not the story. Genesis doesn't make sense if that's the story, because he preserves the life of Noah. And then he calls Abraham, and then Jacob is just a sack of problems. And then his wives breed him like a goat. That's one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament is he's breeding his uncle's goats to get more money, and his wives are breeding him in a tent for pomegranates. He's a male prostitute in his own house. And you're reading that going, this is a really messed up story, and this is the guy that you're going to use? And so this kind of responsible scholarship really kind of fortifies our faith. And then here's my bibliography, and Bob will have these. I highly recommend that you read the book, The Bible Among Myths. unique revelation or just ancient literature written by John Oswald. Because what he's going to say is everything else in the ancient Near East was a myth. But the Bible, even though it uses a lot of the same imagery and same stories, is a completely different concept of what is going on. Because a myth exists only in a closed system, and the Old Testament believes that there's a creator that is not submitted to what he created, that he's outside the system. And so that's a really good book. And then there were supposed to be times for questions, but I went too long. And so I apologize for that, but I really appreciate you guys letting me be here. Sit here.
Well, thank you, Stan. And crafty fellow that I am, we had some computer issues up here earlier, and so we copied his files across to my computer just in case we needed to use my computer as a backup. And then the ploy of having the computer glitches worked itself out. He was able to use his own laptop. But the consequences then of all that means I have copies of his files now on my computer. So that worked out well. All right, well, we're going to have a 15-minute break, so we'll come back at 3:25, and we'll have our second speaker for the afternoon. So take a 15-minute break. Austin Bible Church is a grace ministry. No price is ever assigned to any video, audio, printed material, or anything provided by this ministry. Costs associated with such grace provision are paid in full by grace-oriented born-again believers in Jesus Christ, motivated by God the Holy Spirit, well-pleasing to God the Father. More information on our grace-giving policy and your opportunity to join in this Grace Financial Fellowship can be found at the link in the description below.